We are recording this session, and information on this will be available following the summit. So just to let you all know that there will be recordings available the week after the summit. All right. With that, I think we'll get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Washington Bike Walk and Roll Summit presented by Amazon. My name is Tamara Schuhendler. I am the community organizer at Cascade Bicycle Club, and I'll be introducing us in today. We also have Barb Chamberlain here from Washington State Department of Transportation, who will be our moderator for the day. We're excited to have over 500 registrants for this 5-day virtual event. We'd like to start with a land acknowledgement today. This summit is virtual, but it is rooted on Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish tribal lands. We acknowledge the land that we sit on and occupy today as the traditional home of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish tribal nations. Without them, we would not have access to this environment. We take the opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. We'd also like to note that we are recording this session and that this session will be available following the summit. The summit is hosted by Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes, two sister statewide organizations with a shared vision of bicycling for all. Cascade Bicycle Club hosts rides and events, advocates for safe spaces for bicyclists, and educates riders of all ages and abilities throughout Washington State. Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclist rights, endorses political candidates, holds officials accountable, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safe and accessible for all. We'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, whose collective contributions have enabled us to bring together 15 panels of expert speakers with free registration for all attendees. We'd like to thank Amazon, our presenting sponsor. We'd also like to thank our supporting sponsor, the Washington State Department of Transportation Active Transportation Division and Eastern Washington Region, as well as our general sponsors, the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration, and Stacey Bain Bike Lawyers. Also, a note before we jump into the session, we will be maintaining a standard of conduct to ensure that all participants feel safe and respected. We want to ensure that every person has a safe space here. We believe that every person has the right to be treated with dignity and respect and be free from all forms of harassment. So we ask of all our attendees that you be fully present in this session, be self-responsible and self-challenging, listen and process, suspend judgment of yourselves and others, and use respectful language towards each other and the panel. Also, if you have any questions or concerns during the session, please feel free to reach out to our chat monitors who are labeled in our chat bar with any questions or comments. All right. With that, I'll now quickly introduce our session, our panelists, and then I'll pass it over to Barb, our moderator, to get us started. This is Equitable Outreach and Community Engagement in a Pandemic. Our panelists are Annya Pintak, the Transportation Equity Manager at Seattle Department of Transportation, and Huynh from Seattle Chinatown International District Preservation and Development Authority, as well as SDOT's Transportation Equity Workgroup. Oxas at Race, Ancestors, Health, Outdoors, and Knowledge, or RAHOK, and Lauren Squires at the Seattle Planning Commission. So in this panel today, you'll join representatives from the Seattle Planning Commission, Seattle Department of Transportation, Equity Workgroup, and Race, Ancestors, Health, Outdoors, and Knowledge as they discuss how to equitably reach communities and connect community input to infrastructure and policy outcomes, ensuring that voices from historically marginalized or underserved communities are listened to. These experts share their tactics and perspectives on how to put equity work and outreach into practice and keep these practices at the forefront of active transportation planning. With that, I'll stop sharing my slides and I'll pass it over to Barb and our panelists. But again, thank you all for being here today. Barb, you're on mute currently.
Okay, that was a change that happened when I changed screens because I wasn't unmuted a minute ago. At any rate, it's Monday, it's early. Thanks everybody for making us part of how you're going to start this week, and we hope you stay with us through the week. We have so many wonderful speakers, and this morning's presentation should get you charged up to keep walking and rolling with us all week long. I am really privileged to get you started with this wonderful panel. We're going to ask each of them to do their own quick introduction in a different way, which is to give you a couple of takeaways that get your creative and learning juices flowing. And then we'll plunge into some questions we've got for them to respond to. As Tamar mentioned, drop your questions into the chat, and Wendy and Vicki will help us come around to those towards the end of the discussion. So with that, I'd ask Annya to kick us off.
Great, thank you so much, Barb. Hi folks, good morning. I'm Annya Pintak from Seattle Department of Transportation, Transportation Equity Manager. And I would say two key takeaways in this session that I think all of us here will be able to touch on is how to build authentic, transparent relationships when it comes to outreach and community engagement is the pillar of success, and I think just a key item in terms of establishing relationships, especially with communities of color. And I think that another important piece is that really considering and remembering that engagement and outreach is a two-way street. And so I hope that is a key takeaway that you all believe in, and I think we can all touch on that. And just very quickly about my role, I'm the Transportation Equity Manager there, but I'm also the staff liaison to our Transportation Equity Workgroup, who you will be meeting today as well on the panel. So thank you for having me.
Super. On.
Good morning, everyone. This is Huynh. I work at the Seattle Chinatown International District Preservation and Development Authority, as well as with Annya on the Transportation Equity Workgroup. I think the two main things that I hope to share out today are lessons learned from doing a lot of online engagement, really for the first time with the Transportation Equity Workgroup, doing surveys and focus groups and kind of our lessons learned and best practices from those. And then I also hope to share what it's like doing community engagement and outreach in the Chinatown International District, which is a primarily immigrant and refugee population, non-English speaking. And what I would argue is that we've always been doing outreach and engagement differently because the normal modes of outreach and engagement have always not worked for our community. So I hope to elevate those as well. Thank you for having me.
Rio.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Rio Oxas. I am here in Tongvalands, here in Pasadena area, so I'm happy to be joining the panel. And I think that for me, the biggest takeaways will be around one, I think compassion will be during this time. I think we need to forefront that for ourselves and then for our communities and then for our earth. So obviously a lot of what I've been thinking about is creating neighborhoods that actually meet the essential needs of everybody so that our grandmas can walk within 20 minutes to every single essential service at a high quality rate. So I really want people to walk away with this idea to push our minds beyond imagination, and everything we thought was impossible, that it is possible right now, and that we can thank all our Black Lives Matters leadership and climate change leadership during this time, and then all our health providers during this COVID pandemic, that we can really thank and look at their leadership to create those new neighborhoods that really reflect truly what we need as humans, and then what our native flora and fauna need in that space. Good morning, everybody.
Thanks, Rio. Lauren.
Hi, my name's Lauren Squires, she, her pronouns, and I'm coming to you from Southeast Seattle. Here I live about a 10-minute bike ride from the Othello light rail station, and I'm wearing two hats today. One is a Seattle Planning Commissioner, and I also am a multimodal transportation planner at Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates. That's my day job. But a little bit about the Seattle Planning Commission. We are a 16-member volunteer advisory body that advises the mayor and city council of Seattle on planning and land use issues. So we are, again, 16 volunteers ranging from skill sets of urban design, public health, transportation, or architecture. And so we also do proactive work we recently published a white paper called A Racially Equitable and Resilient Recovery. And so I'll be speaking from that today. I also, as I said, work as a multimodal transportation planner at Nelson Nygaard, and so I work on active transportation plans and multimodal transportation street plans, complete streets design over the state of Washington. So the takeaway that I'd like to kind of leave us with to keep in the forefront of our minds for this conversation is that the impacts of COVID-19 have not been equal. They have not affected everyone equally, rather they have either reflected or deepened the pre-existing inequities in our communities, whether that be for transit-dependent populations or frontline workers who are often people of color and working class folks. And so equitable engagement is really not just a line item on a project budget or a box to check. It's really these communities' communication line into decision-making processes. And I think that we would all agree that we want our services, our streets, anything we're investing in to work for everyone, especially those who need it the most. And so as we talk about kind of strategies for equitable engagement, I would love for us to keep kind of in the forefront of our mind that this is really about centering the voices of those most vulnerable, most impacted, or that have the most to gain from our investments in our decision-making processes. I'll end with a quote that says, "Nothing about us without us is for us." And so we're going to have a conversation about how to center that today. Thanks.
Outstanding. So you can tell already, you've already learned some things and gotten a chance to start thinking. I'm going to throw out a question, ask Annya to maybe get the ball rolling, and then other panelists jump in as you feel moved to speak. What does, and we've already talked about this a bit, but I think unpacking some more, what does equitable outreach and community engagement look like and mean to you in a broad sense? And along the way as well, if we make sure we're defining terms that maybe people use in different ways or are less familiar to some folks, I think having that would be helpful as well.
Thank you, Barb. I love this question, and I hear this a lot, and especially in government, but I think in multiple different settings, we use the term outreach and community engagement interchangeably, that they mean the same thing. And I want to make it very clear that to me, and I would argue too with a lot of the communities that I have served, outreach and engagement are two different things. They're connected, but they're two different things. When I think about community engagement, it is a holistic and relationship building and continuous process. Outreach is a tactic and a strategy that is a part of engagement. So when I think about outreach could be items such as, I'm going to go out to a school fair and I'm going to table and I'm going to share more information about biking. Or I'm going to go door to door and I'm going to speak with community members and let them know about a construction project that's happening down their street. That to me is outreach. That to me is a tactic. But community engagement is that authentic relationship building. And you can't have successful outreach without having a community engagement and building that relationship. So I want to make that very clear. With my work with the Transportation Equity Workgroup, so I've met Anne, I've known Anne, for almost like a year and a half now. It's been such a fun journey in the Transportation Equity Workgroup, but we meet monthly. I talk to Anne as well as the TEW members, the Transportation Equity Workgroup members regularly. And I would say that is community engagement because I'm fostering relationship with community. And so I want to throw that out to folks, and I'd like for folks to remember that. And so when you're thinking about doing engagement and outreach, I think the first thing you need to ask yourself is, do I have relationships with the communities that I'm planning to serve or that I'm planning to work with? And if I don't, how can I start a relationship? And I think especially if we're talking about Black and Brown communities and communities of color, we need to recognize that there's not a lot of trust, especially with government. And there's a reason why. And there's a reason why, and I think a lot of folks on the panel can talk about this too. And I hope that a lot of participants currently sitting in this session understand that the impact of racial inequities in transportation system causes this distrust. So especially in government, we can't expect to go into communities of color and say, okay, partner with me, let's do community engagement together, let's do outreach together. It's not going to work that way. So I would really ask yourself and say, how do I build this relationship and how do I authentically show up? And I give a lot of credit. I would say where I learned was truly on the ground. I am not a planner. I am a social worker by training. And when I first started working in King County, I worked in SeaTac in South King County with an amazing organization called Global to Local. And SeaTac, for many of you who don't know, or you do know this, has a high population of immigrant and refugee communities. And when I first worked for the organization, I worked with an amazing team of community health promotoras who went out and taught diabetes education and nutrition, diet, on the ground and in a culturally responsive way. And they did it their own way, in their own language, and their own culture. And I truly learned from them on how to build relationships. So I want to give a shout out to SeaTac. I want to give a shout out to South King County, because that is where I really learned the differences, but the relationship between community engagement and outreach.
Super. Anybody else want to add to that? And quick note to the panelists, if you just unmute yourself, that's your cue to all of us that you've got a thought you want to drop in here.
Yeah, no, Anya, that was really beautifully said. And I absolutely want to just ditto and echo a lot of the points you're saying. And I guess I'm going to give a little like direction towards even like a lot of our community organizers who may be on this phone call themselves. And we know, when I was working with People for Mobility Justice, we did a lot of work engaging with Metro and LADOT and etc. And I think one of the things I learned as an organizer or grassroots organizer, or even being within nonprofits, is that we have to value ourselves. So we have to really push for that. You know, it's sad too, because we hope to be just valued, but if they're not, we need to make it very clear that we're a valuable asset to the DOTs, to the transit agencies, because otherwise they might not actually know, which is a little bit, obviously we're working on that, but it's really important that we do that. And we know that that value also means fair compensation, respect, and actual authentic power in leadership, right? And that's where community engagement really needs to go to that next level of how do we actually have authentic power, not only at that table, but in our table, in our neighborhoods, right? The communities are ours. So I just wanted to put that plug in for anybody who's organizing in that way.
All right. Any terms that people hear in our conversation along the way, if you hear a term and you're not sure how it's being used, drop that into the chat. And our moderators, I'll try to watch that, but our helpful behind the curtain folks will also say, okay, Barb, you need to ask somebody to talk about that one a bit more so we can keep it flowing. With that as some grounding in terms of how important it is to have authentic and ongoing relationships, we're obviously facing extraordinary challenges on top of the existing extraordinary problems. So could you all talk a bit about how the pandemic has impacted the methods you use, the approaches you take? You know, we're in a virtual environment as we speak here. So take that away, whoever wants to get that one started. Maybe, Anne, you talked about outreach and your challenge.
Yeah, definitely. I can kick us off. So I'll be sharing my experiences working in the Chinatown International District. And for folks who aren't familiar with that area, we are based kind of just south of downtown Seattle. It's a very dense neighborhood, just about half a square mile, where we have a lot of small mom and pop businesses, but also a high number of residents that are mostly elderly or young families. And so these folks are immigrants and refugees, primarily Cantonese and Vietnamese speaking. And for our work, I really want to emphasize what Anya said about relational work, because so much of what we do in the ID is building those relationships. And that hasn't changed because of COVID. But we haven't been able to do in-person events. And a lot of our work that we did was door-to-door outreach. So obviously those things couldn't happen anymore. And so we really had to pivot to really think about how do we continue these relationships in the ID. And what we found ourselves doing was relying on kind of more of the old school methods of outreach. It was phone calls, it was texting, using platforms like WeChat, plugging into what our community members were already doing and really relying on those relationships that we built over the years to continue our work. I think, so yeah, there was a lot of face-to-face that we couldn't do, but because of the relationships that we had already built, we were able to reach out to businesses to talk about grants and loans that were available to folks during this time. I would also say that something that hasn't changed because of COVID was kind of the role that community-based organizations play between communities and entities like government or grantors. We often find ourselves kind of the mediator between what folks want to share with communities. And I think that relationship is really important to consider because it can be a huge power imbalance. I think a lot of times folks treat CBOs as just like a checkbox, again, a method to get their information out, but you also have to realize that you are relying on our relationships with community to get your information out. And so, the way that you work with CBOs also says, culturally based or community-based organizations. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think when entities work with communities, I think giving us time and respecting the relationships that we have is so, so important.
Thanks, Anne. I'll chime in on this one. This is Lauren. So if we're talking about methods and approaches for equitable engagement in the time of COVID, when we can't gather in person, I'll just echo this theme of continued relationship building and meeting people where they're at. That's what we use when we can gather in person, but if we can't, we can still carry those values into how we engage folks. And Mary, I see your question about doing engagement with older adults, and I have an idea for you, but I think in addition to meeting people where they're at, thinking about the community specific to who you want to reach. Is it older adults? Is it youth? Is it a particular demographic? And thinking about the mediums and the places and the information resources that those folks access made a perfect kind of case for community-based organizations. Those are the pre-existing relationships that community members rely on. Those are the folks they're in touch with. And so if you can compensate and work with those people to then continue to be invested in your planning process and whatever investment or collaboration you're looking to make, those folks can be amazing kind of mouthpieces for the work and the messaging and the participation that you're inviting on your projects. So Mary, my idea for you is utility bill mailers. A lot of older folks, they still open their mail, and so you can work with the city or the utility district to design. I did this for my work in the city of Linwood on their active and accessible transportation plan for, hey, we have an online open house. Of course, we've had to switch all in-person engagement to online, which I think is best practice even when we can gather. To have a virtual equivalent to get your information, you don't have to show up in person. A lot of people can't show up in person, especially the folks that are most impacted or have the most to benefit from your investments, whether that be shift workers, families, people where their in-person time is really valuable. So these tools of utility bill mailers, using the telephone, I know it sounds ridiculous, but we can do telephone town halls where people can call in and listen. Mailers with detachable surveys that have prepaid postage. I see some of my Bainbridge Island friends are on this webinar, and we're working on their sustainable transportation plan. That's my Nelson Nygaard hat. And we sent a mailer with project information, ways to get involved, and then a detachable kind of mail back in survey. And so we've really tried to bridge the digital divide, because as Mary pointed out in the chat, a lot of folks aren't online. There still really exists that divide of, I don't have enough data on my cell phone, I don't have internet at home. And so thinking about these engagement methods that really stay true to our values and really underscore meeting people where they're at and continuing to build a relationship. So those would be my takeaways.
And Rio, I wonder if you might add on, thinking particularly about the challenges for folks who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the time of COVID, more on engagement in those harder hit communities.
Yeah, it's been, you know, first just like my deep sentiments and love and compassion for all of our communities that are Black and Indigenous. It's been a war zone, you know, and I want to take a moment to just acknowledge that, right? It's been really intense for some communities, lots of deaths, lots of traumatic events at this time, right? For multiple things, and because of that, it also presents a challenge, right? I think for a lot of us who are maybe organizing around infrastructure, things that might seem completely at the bottom of the list, right? When we're talking about family members in the emergency room, right? Or we're talking about folks out protesting, etc., right? And so I think again, that's where that word compassion is, right? And I'll keep coming back to that. We're like, how do we go and meet people with compassion, right? Because people are really going through that a lot. And it's one of the reasons why I really want all of us, the DOTs, the transit agencies, the public health agencies, the housing agencies, all of the government agencies, to start working and looking at neighborhoods, full neighborhoods. You know, I think often what we've been doing as organizers, we've been kind of planning at a county-wide scale, just the infrastructure, and then on a separate note, completely different set of people, planning county-wide health notes, right? And these are the things that keep disconjointed and disconnected our communities, right? So I think part of what we're gonna have to do in engagement is say, hey, look, we're actually trying to set up neighborhoods that are fully thriving, have clinics, have schools that your children can go to safely, even during COVID, right? Because I'm seeing it. I'm seeing neighborhoods that are wealthy having schools where there's outdoors and they are separated and they have plexiglasses, all that stuff. And then our kids are not. Our kids are behind a computer all day long. My partner and I have kids. We have a couple kids and we're seeing that, right? So there's a lot of that compassion piece that needs to be put into it, right? And so I think, first of all, we're really going to have to push our beyond imagination piece that I keep talking about. How do we create those communities, and how do we engage community members that we're actually going to do something different? We're not going to do the same thing. We're not going to go back to normal. We're not going to sit there and be like, yeah, let's just think about infrastructure at a county level, but not think about it in a neighborhood level so that you have all your needs met, right? I think we're going to have to change our organizing in that way so that we can actually meet people where they're at. Hey, this infrastructure matters, this transportation matters because it's how you get to work, and we need to make it safe by public health standards. And so by that way, we need to bring the public health officials, and we also don't want you to commute for 3 hours, right? Like, we also don't want you to be exposed to community. You know, I think often as an organizer, we often, you know, fight for small wins, such as like, we just want timely buses so that our folks can get out to their 3-hour commute job. You know, it's like, no, the job should be right there, right? So the people who do the labor rights stuff within the city, they need to be there too at the table organizing that. So I think we're going to have to think about that, you know, on a practical sense, right? Like that's big dream. We have to do it, right? On a practical sense, I saw some amazing things at Latino Health Access. So it's a shout out to Latino Health Access in Santana. And we were getting our COVID tests actually just on Friday, and with my partner and our 2 kids. And we were going through the line, and the Latino Health Access had all their PPE equipment, so their personal protection equipment, very well done, a big long stick, and they were handing resources to every family that went through there in Spanish. They just boom, boom. And I thought that was incredible. And I thought, geez, everywhere. It can happen anywhere. Food banks, testing sites, right? School kids, oh yeah, at our school kids pick up and drop off zones, right? Already other CBOs have already put in there. Same with us, Same with the transportation folks, because the reality is, because I've taken the buses actually during the pandemic, and it is intense. You see the people that are on there have been working 18-hour shifts, some of them. I know I had a conversation with this woman. And so also putting yourself in that situation, if you are actually doing the transportation piece, do it, walk the streets, bike the streets, get in the bus yourself. So you know exactly what you're talking about and you see who's on there. And then again, you go back to the compassion piece. How do I leverage the most vulnerable communities and make sure that they are top center, right? And I know that for me, I am going to push this, that's where the Black Lives Matter leadership is going to really come in handy. They're telling us how to do this in a very thoughtful way. So I will just, I'll leave it at that piece.
Barb, can I just add on to piggyback off of what Rio and Ann and Lauren have said? I think one item I want to stress to folks too as well is that community-based organizations that are on the ground, they know their communities the best. So we need to stop going in. When I say we, I'm talking about as government staff. We need to stop going in and saying, this is the solution. This is how we're going to do outreach and engagement, and really think about it in a co-organizing and co-collaboration. Like, how are you going to co-collaborate on this together? And so one example I'd love to share is related to a project with the Lake City Senior Center. And we all know that with transit, everything has changed with transit. A lot has changed. A lot of safety protocols related to wearing face coverings and sanitizing the buses more regularly. But we know that a lot of seniors depend on transit. And so one of the things that we were thinking about was, okay, how do we get this information out to the senior community, knowing that there's a digital divide? And so we partnered with one of the senior centers, and I asked them straight up, I said, how are you all handling your programmings? How are you all changing the programming, so that I can listen to them, and then I can think about, okay, what are some ways that we can collaborate and piggyback off of their programs that they've shifted? So one thing is, for example, their senior meal programs. They used to have senior hot meals every day during lunch, but obviously with COVID, they couldn't do that. And so they were delivering meals out. And they shared with me that they do delivery, at least for that site, every Thursday. And so what we decided together on, we decided that to create print out information in different languages, and we put them with the senior meals so that the meals and the information got delivered. Another program that they were trying to kick off, where they were doing, Zoom Tai Chi, they were doing, language classes over phone calls. So they were starting to do some level of digital and, audio related engagement. And one thing that they were testing was just a senior socialization hour over Uber call. We know that a lot of seniors experience social isolation, and they feel really lonely. And a lot of the times these programs is a way to have connection with one another. And so they were kicking off a regular thing over Uber call. It was very small, but we pitched them. We said, hey, how about we join you for a call? And maybe it could be a fun, just a conversation and dialogue with seniors to share with them more about how to ride transit at this time, and just an open dialogue. And two ladies were on it, and we had the social worker there, and it was so much fun. I mean, you could tell that these ladies just wanted to connect and just chat with one another, but we got to share key information about transit. They were asking us questions like, okay, what bus routes are currently on pause? Is it running? They asked, I'm really confused about this face mask protocol. Like, are we supposed to use it on the bus? Is the driver going to kick us off? And one hilarious thing, and we were just like chatting and laughing. And, we said, there is the route that's still going. There's one that goes directly to the International District. And one of the ladies said, yeah, I know, I always go to Wajimaya, but the senior hours are always from like 7 to 9. And do they think that we are just up that early? I just don't understand. And it was just, we all started laughing. And I share that story because, again, even from a digital standpoint, right now people are wanting that human engagement. And so I just feel, don't lose that opportunity, and really start, even now with COVID, even through all the difficult times, this is still a key moment where we can really build relationships and you can start that community engagement.
This is great, and I feel like you're talking about things that are important anytime, and especially now when folks are disconnected. You're already sharing some really tangible tools and tactics and ideas, and I think if you just keep running with those and continue on this theme you're on of the folks who have greater barriers to participation, whether that's digital or cultural or age-related or disability, maybe talk a bit about how you handle accessibility concerns and needs for your outreach as well. And whoever wants to run with that one.
This is Lauren. I can hop in and kind of keep riffing on this theme. So a memory comes to mind for me. I recently worked with, this is again with my Nelson Nygaard hat, worked on the Rapid Ride I line, which is going to connect through Renton, Kent, Auburn. And so this is South King County here on the west side. And King County Metro has really been taking this to heart to think about compensating, bringing together community advocates, just community members, to serve as a mobility board to then advise on the transit restructuring that is going to happen when, you know, several transit lines come together and are elevated to high capacity transit. And so one of the roles that I got to do was support this mobility board as a facilitator. And it was maybe one of the highlights of my career thus far. It was so powerful to see folks of all different walks of life, but especially folks with mobility impairments. I learned so much from this gentleman who was blind and scheduled paratransit rides, and he would get to and from these mobility board meetings at the Kent Senior Center, people that used mobility devices, and they were all advising on, you know, these are the barriers that I experienced when I'm trying to access transit, either in Kent, Renton, or Auburn. And these folks, we would bring them together and we got to teach them transit planning, which is total nerd zone, but was really fun to teach folks about that. And then they would say, okay, I understand these are the levers that we work. We can make the bus run for a longer period of time. It can come more frequently. The facilities can look different. And at the end, we had the Renton, Kent, Auburn area mobility plan to complement Rapid Ride R line or Rapid Ride I line implementation. And it was so rich with these community members' kind of ownership and experience to say, these are the solutions that are going to work for us. You say you want us to take transit more, well, here are the barriers, and here's the solutions that would help me overcome them. And so that's an example of bringing together a board or a group of community members, compensating them, having budget where you are literally paying them for their time. We pay these people $150 an hour for their time, or $125 an hour for their time. And it was so powerful, and it really resulted in a plan that is really meaningful and authentic for this community. So that was a memory that was triggered for me, Barb, from the accessibility component of solutions.
And Lauren just modeled behavior that I need to be reminded of. If you are blind or low vision, and I am just a voice coming at you, I didn't start by saying, this is Barb. Lauren started by saying, this is Lauren. And so for anybody who cannot see the screen and see our labels, that's an accessibility measure in a virtual meeting. So this is Barb. And I also then get to describe that Rio did a big thumbs up when Lauren mentioned paying people for their time. So Rio, I wonder if you would expand on the importance of that as a means of equity for engagement.
Yeah, actually, this is Rio. Thank you for modeling that. This is a very good thing to be mindful about, you know, like our diligence is very much needed at this time. As far as the compensation piece, I gave a big thumbs up because I heard $125 per hour per person. That's incredible. And it's exactly what it should be. That's the bare minimum, really. And I think Brian asked the question about how do we create these very complete communities, these neighborhoods, right? The ecosystems these neighborhood ecosystems that I'm beginning to call. And this is how. every time we survey, we ask a question for a community member, we compensate them as professionals because it's professional work, right? I think we have this very weird idea that I don't even know where it came from, that we have this uneven balance for costs of things or people's times. We need all those things equally, right? We need the intel of the community equally. We also need the community to keep gardening. We also need the community to keep cleaning. We also need the community to be essential workers at the grocery shop. There's no reason why anybody shouldn't be paid exactly what they deserve to be paid. We absolutely have the capital. I think people forget that we live in a very wealthy country, and maybe there's some disbalance, right? And then that's a whole nother topic, but we do actually have the capital, and we have to believe it, you know? And just to elaborate a little bit more on Brian's point about these jobs that hopefully can keep going forward, right? So that we can create neighborhoods. I think about also, how do we have community members steward the land, right? Our cities, our neighborhoods, our indigenous communities have always done that globally, right? And by indigenous, I mean worldwide. And they've been stewarding the land, even the way that our mountains have been burning on fire. Everybody knows that throughout the West Coast, our mountains have been burning through fires, but a lot of the communities actually live there who could be stewarding the mountains, but they could also be stewarding our neighborhoods, our city streets, walking it, making sure it's safe for our children and our elders to go along. There's so many ways to steward the very land, cleaning it up, right? These are all jobs that can be paid and compensated. It actually helps city streets. It helps the transportation. It helps keeping everybody walking and rolling, right? Which is what we're about. And it helps create that sense of safety. Oh, there's always community ambassadors from the neighborhood are always walking up and down the street, right? That would mitigate so many of the concerns around literally our bodily safety, but also traffic collisions, right? Because you know that somebody's always watching on every block. And maybe there are elders, right? Maybe there are teenagers, right? There's so many opportunities to create work. And this is what I mean by how do we push ourselves beyond the imagination piece? But that compensation piece is going to be key to creating thriving communities, because it does not make sense to have a very impoverished community. It's bad for everybody. And that's what I think everybody needs to understand. Impoverished communities is bad for everybody. It wins nobody any good. So I'll end with that.
You know, I don't know how many times I've had the chance to hear you speak, and I always just love your energy, so thank you for that. We have maybe another 7 minutes or so for people to be dropping questions in. We allowed 10 minutes at the end for audience questions, and we've done some along the way. But I guess I would ask each of our panelists, and maybe in the same order we started with, so starting with Annya, just where your head is now after hearing what others have said. What would you add to the conversation, or what new ideas might you share with folks for thinking about both equitable engagement and outreach?
Well, I'm just really inspired. This is a great way to start a Monday morning. So I'm really inspired hearing from all the other panelists. And, you know, I think everyone has just shared amazing tools and tips. And I would say, you know, I would just say that the compensation piece, 100%, 1,000%, couldn't agree more, especially in government. And I know we have a lot of challenges in government because of a lot of the red tape that is there, but the red tape there is there for a reason, and we can rip it off. It's just, you got to be creative. You just have to really push through. So a lot of government staff, if you're sitting on it, I just encourage you to do that. I think another piece that I want to add is that any type of community engagement, also ask yourself, how are we going to ensure that communities are set up for success when we kick off this engagement? And the way that I think about that too is engagement is also about capacity building for communities. A lot of the time, communities just have not had the tools, have not had the opportunity to engage in government or engage in planning or whatever it is related to transportation that we want to talk about. And so one item with the Transportation Equity Workgroup that I did was kicking off onboarding and orientation for them. And I really thought about this because we do so much at SDOT, and it is really easy, I get it, to confuse what we do at SDOT with all of the other transportation agencies. And so we can't expect community members to sit in advisory capacity and be able to advise if they don't know the information related to what we do within SDOT. And so the first orientation we did was more of a meet and greet with one another. We did a timeline activity that I actually took from the Office of Planning and Community Development. They did an activity where they had a timeline of specific time in history. And we asked each community member, we gave everybody a Post-it note, and we asked, what are some key events that happened in your community or personally or within larger in your community during these time periods and during these time period. And we went all the way back to like the 1400s, 1300s to present period. And so we got to really learn about the impacts of inequities and racism and discrimination on communities. But then we also had a 2-day, what I called professional development summit. They were 8-hour days. And I called it SDOT school. So essentially it was an onboarding opportunity for community members to hear what we do at SDOT. And I worked with SDOT staff. It took about like 6 to 8 months to create a curriculum on this, but super high level. So what is the city's budget process? What is master planning? What is the right of way? Key concept. And so that's really important. And what I would say with that onboarding orientation curriculum, as much as it was great for community members, it was also good for government staff and transportation staff to participate in, because it took us out of this habit of having to use technical jargon, of having to use the language that you use daily with our colleagues, and instead think about, okay, how are we going to explain these concepts to community in a way that makes sense, that a way that is understandable. And so it was as much as an exercise for staff. And I just want to really point out that in any type of engagement or outreach, like think also, and this is part of the relationship building, how are we going to ensure that communities are going to be successful? So I would just add that.
Hi folks, this is Anne. A couple of just small things that came up to me throughout this was just how do you set yourself up for successful engagement and outreach, right? And I think for me, one of the really basic ways is make sure that your budget covers it at the very beginning. Not only are you covering for translation, so that is all written materials, right? That needs to be translated and also preferably also community reviewed before you send them out to community. And then also budget for interpretation, which is like live interpretation of what is being said. And make sure that those folks are well compensated for their work and time, because that is really a skill that is not compensated enough. So one is just budget for those things before your project even starts. Have that line item in there. And another thing that I want to build off of is what both Rio and Annya said about capacity building. From my experience, a lot of folks in the ID aren't used to being asked about their experiences and what they think about certain things. And I think it's up to us to kind of start to build that culture of having folks see how important their experience is and how important like their day-to-day is in informing these changes. And, we go up to our grandmas and ask them to fill out the survey and they're like, why me? And sometimes that first interaction won't result in a survey, but I think part of the work that we have to do is to show how community voices result in actual change. And for us, what we really try and think about is like, how do we get folks to see the larger picture of how their engagement changes things, but then also doing things in the short term to show that change is possible. So for an example, we are trying to revitalize an alley in our neighborhood that has a lot of like sanitation issues, public safety issues. And so we got together a board of community members, so business owners, property owners, residents, and we got folks thinking about like, what if this alley was a community alley, like what kind of events, what kind of like art would you want in there? And we had to explain that like this is going to take years and kind of slow steps, but kind of in the meantime, we were able to work on these 4 murals that we were able to put in the alley to, celebrate the beauty that we already have here. And so kind of celebrating those small wins as you build capacity with the neighborhood and with your community members.
Rio, what would you add?
Yeah, I think as some of my I guess closing thoughts as we're wrapping up our full panel part, but I know we have questions left for the audience, is that I really think we're going to have to think about, well, actually, RAHOK, I was just thinking about that right now. I was like, geez, one of the things that RAHOK, one of the reasons why I founded this organization, which is a family-owned organization actually, is that it stands for race, ancestors, health, outdoors, and knowledge. And when we're looking at all of our communities in that way, and even in that order, we start really enriching our communities, and some of the things that, as all the panelists have been thinking, my imagination has been going wild, and I thought, wow, we really have this chance to design beautiful, incredible, thriving neighborhoods. And to Anne's point, it's like, yeah, our community members are everything we need. Some of them come with really rich experiences from their own countries. Really though, rich experiences in actually gardening, cooking healthy food, building homes, building street structures that are actually more sustainable than cement. It's already there, the knowledge, and that's why I have the knowledge piece. It's already there in our communities. And when we really can see that, and see that actually the quote unquote impoverished communities are the richest assets we have in our neighborhoods, we really begin to start changing the script, and we can actually build communities that meet everybody's needs, including the earth, right? Because a lot of immigrant communities, not all of them, but a lot of immigrant communities come from what I call earth-based tribes or earth-based communities, right? Which is all about that relationship, right? There's a relationship to each other, and then there's also that relationship we have to all of our elements and to our earth, right? And so I know that it seems like it's like, maybe too far out there, but really it's where I think we need to start heading. And I think if anything that pandemic has shown us, it's a respiratory disease, it's a respiratory disease, and our air is suffering. And we know that because of climate change. We've seen it because of the smoke, right? All of us on the Western coast, I flew over to Alaska and it was smoke. I couldn't believe it, and so these things is what we're going to have to start thinking about. How do we take care of the people and the earth simultaneously, and that it is possible? We have tons of, going to Anya's point, we actually have historical data that we can do this, and we've been doing this, and so it's like, how do we lift that back up, right? And so that's kind of what I was sitting around just as people were speaking. I'm very inspired by all the panelists here. Was just like, yeah, we can actually design beautiful cities right now. And I'll end with another resource, and I'll put these resources, I'll put my website, because I actually go through the values and then how to think about it on my website. But there's also another really, she's an elder to me now, Arundhati Roy, who wrote The Pandemic is a Portal. If you haven't read it, please read it, because it's about the idea that now, even as folks in transportation, we have an opportunity to change everything. And one thing I will say to all of us here who are related to transportation is that we are the arteries of every social justice movement. Literally, we are how we get to education, clinics, jobs, resources, gardens, outdoors. So we actually have a really big task on our hands, and what may seem irrelevant, right? Like I said at the beginning, it's actually one of the most relevant and pressing things in our hands as transportation. And it's why I'm still here. So I'll close there.
That was beautiful, Rio. I really appreciate how you connect us to hope. I think it's really easy in this time to feel downtrodden, and rightfully so. But I see a question in the chat. I'll just kind of transition us that direction. Is it okay to say we can't do outreach now due to COVID? Could you anticipate a scenario where you recommend pausing, or is it just an excuse? I'm not going to directly answer that question, because I think that it's unique to each project or process and at the scale at which you're operating. And I think that it should be true to to the context of a project. But I will say, I just want to amplify everything that the panelists just said, from Anya's SDOT school, like breaking down all of our planner terminology to remove those barriers of access and engagement for folks, to An's story about the grandma of like, why me? And it's like, your experience matters. Like, how, you know, the barriers and how comfortable or uncomfortable you feel on our streets, on our buses matter. And this is how we're going to use your feedback. And so I would just underscore the need to build trust in this time, and just kind of under Rio's theme of compassion in this time, people remember how you make them feel at their most vulnerable. And I think just professionally in this time, I've struggled with sounding a little tone deaf when I'm asking people what their mobility preferences are, when they can't even pay their rent or afford food, or they have loved ones that are sick. And so I think placing our investments, our planning processes in the real context of our times and how we craft engagement. And I would just if you take one nugget away, this is about building capacity in communities, inviting them, asking them, and really listening to how they want to participate, what they need, and how mobility can help be in service of those goals. At Nelson Nygaard, we say transportation is how you change the world, and you start by putting people first. So I'll start there. I'll stop there.
Super. We have about 4 minutes left, so any of you who want to chime in and take a look at some of these questions, I dropped in the Arundhati Roy piece, and there was a question about beginning, and this is maybe sort of spinning us back up, but a question about how do you establish relationship, or how do you build on a relationship you've established virtually. At some point, we might move into the next phase of being able to see real people in real spaces. Any thoughts about, I guess this is the hope theme, bridging forward to building on what you've done in this virtual space and time? If that makes sense as a question.
Yeah, this is Annya. I will say I'm going to connect it to the point Lauren just made, because I don't think pausing is bad, but if you're pausing just because as an excuse in terms of you don't want to do it, then that's a problem. But if you're pausing and saying, hey, we're going to take this time to pause and regroup and rethink of how do we do outreach and engagement in a socially distanced way, then I think that's totally fine. But be transparent with whatever community you're communicating it to, because transparency goes a very, very long way. So I would just add that. I think at some point, knock on wood, I know we will be back to normal and we will be engaging in person again. And I think there is a way to definitely connect what you started virtually to, one-on-one or more in a physical space. So, I think I would look at this virtual space as like building the kind of like the foundation, like building the foundation. If you don't have that relationship, build that foundation through the virtual. And then how do you ramp up as things kind of get back to the recovery mode, meeting in person? How can we ramp up and really scale that engagement up again? So I would look at it that way. Yeah. And I know we have a couple of minutes, and I think this point is really important. The question about how, this might be outside the scope, but thoughts on overcoming us versus them with cars versus bike infrastructure, removing parking in front of the house to build bike lanes, for example. Any conversation like that, what's really important is, I think, connecting back to what all the folks have said, is how do you validate people's experiences? Because it's not, many times when I work with communities, especially when it's talking about getting rid of parking or cars, it's not just about parking and cars. There's something deeper. And a lot of the times it's displacement. And so that opens up a larger conversation regarding displacement in the transportation system. And so, I think that's a key piece of thinking about how do we bridge that gap? Well, first you have to have that dialogue and then open it up. you know, where are these feelings coming from, about, and where and how can we further have a dialogue on that, and then work collaboratively on addressing this issue. So I wanted to bring that up because that is something I hear a lot in community.
That feels like a great note to end on. We are at time, and this has been absolutely fantastic. So appreciate everybody's participation and the great questions. The session is being recorded, was recorded, so the links will be available both for folks who registered. You'll get the link, and then Cascade will share it out with others. And of course, you want to make sure you, after you take your bio break and do whatever else you're doing in your morning, that you come back at 12:30 for the keynote from Charles T. Brown of Rutgers, because that will be fabulous as well. And we'll continue this theme on through the end of the day with another session, 4 to 5, on mobility justice. So stay tuned at this BAT channel, and we'll see you later.